The moment my son-in-law put his hand on my shoulder and shoved me toward the front door, I knew it was over. Not me, them. I grabbed my coat from the hook in the hallway, the same hook Arthur had installed the week we moved in, and I walked out of my own house without looking back. Behind me, I could already hear him on the phone. She's gone. Finally. Tell everyone to come over. We're celebrating tonight. But what he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had already made a call of my own, 3 days earlier. My name is Margaret. I am 67 years old. I was a secondary school teacher for 31 years in Hamilton, Ontario. I taught English literature. I believe in stories. I believe that every life has a turning point, a moment where the character either collapses under the weight of what's happening or decides to become someone different. This is mine. Arthur and I bought our house in 1989. It was a detached brick home on a quiet crescent in the east end of Hamilton, not far from the escarpment. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a deep backyard with a silver maple that Arthur planted the spring our daughter was born. We paid $187,000 for it. We thought we were crazy to spend so much. We both worked. We saved. We put down 20% so we wouldn't have to pay mortgage insurance. Arthur was an electrician. I was a teacher. We were not wealthy people, but we were careful people. And careful people build things slowly and keep them. Arthur died of a stroke in 2019. He was 68 years old. He was healthy, as far as we knew. He walked every morning. He ate well. He didn't smoke. He just collapsed one afternoon in the kitchen while he was making a grilled cheese sandwich, and by the time the paramedics arrived, he was already gone. I remember standing in the emergency department, still in my coat, being told by a young doctor who looked barely 30 that my husband of 41 years had passed away. I remember nodding. I remember thanking her. I don't remember driving home. My daughter was 38 at the time. She drove from Mississauga that evening and stayed for a week. She cried with me. She helped me sort through things. She cooked meals I didn't eat. She was good to me that week. That version of her, the one who sat across from me at our kitchen table with swollen eyes and held my hand, that is the daughter I still love. The one who came later is someone I am still trying to understand. She had been with her partner for 4 years by then. They weren't married. He worked in sales, some kind of software company, always vague about the details. He was pleasant enough at Christmas, said the right things, laughed at Arthur's jokes. Arthur didn't trust him. He said it once, quietly, on the drive home from a birthday dinner in the 2nd year they were together. That man is comfortable using other people's good manners against them. I told him he was being ungenerous. I wish I had listened. They got engaged 8 months after Arthur died. I was happy for her. I told myself grief had made me suspicious of everything, that I was projecting my loss onto the people around me. When she called to tell me the news, she sounded like herself again, lighter, excited. I cried on the phone and she thought I was crying from happiness. I was, partly. But I was also crying because I knew, somewhere I couldn't name yet, that things were about to change in a way I wouldn't be able to stop. The conversation about moving in happened on a Sunday in March, 2 years after Arthur passed. My daughter came alone, which should have told me something. We had lunch. I made soup. We talked easily for an hour, the way we used to before everything got complicated. Then she set down her spoon and looked at me with that particular expression I recognized from when she was 16 and wanted to ask something she already knew. The answer should be no. She said they were having trouble with their rent. The landlord had raised it again. Hamilton had gotten expensive. Mississauga was worse. They'd been saving for a down payment, but costs kept climbing and the market kept moving and they felt like they were running in place. She said it would only be for a year, maybe 18 months at most. She said it would be good for me not to be alone in such a big house. She said she'd been worried about me. I want to be honest about this part, because I think it matters. I didn't say yes because I was naive. I said yes because I was lonely. Arthur had been gone for 2 years, and the silence in that house had become something physical, something I moved around like furniture. I thought having my daughter under my roof again would fill some of that. I thought it would be like it used to be. I was wrong, but the longing that made me agree was real, and I don't think there's any shame in admitting it. They moved in on a Saturday in April. She brought boxes of clothes and kitchen things she'd accumulated over 15 years of living on her own. He brought his television, which was significantly larger than mine, and within 48 hours it had replaced mine in the living room. He said it was just more practical, better resolution, easier for everyone. It was the first thing that happened that I didn't push back on. It would not be the last. The first few months were manageable. My daughter and I found a rhythm. She worked from home 3 days a week and we'd have lunch together sometimes. She helped in the garden. She knew how her father had laid it out and she respected that. Her partner was at the office most of the time, or said he was, and in his absence the house felt something close to normal. But he was always there at dinner. And at dinner, he talked. He talked about the housing market, about interest rates, about how wild it was that my house would be worth nearly $1 million now, probably more. He said it lightly, casually. The way people say things when they want to plant a seed without appearing to plant one. I smiled and changed the subject. I am a retired English teacher. I know what subtext sounds like. Small things started shifting. He began parking in the garage, which meant my car was in the driveway in the winter. He didn't ask. He just did it one evening and it was already done by the time I realized. When I mentioned it, my daughter said the garage was better for his car because of the remote start feature, something about the cold. I let it go. He reorganized the basement and put my storage in a corner and his things along the shelves Arthur had built. He replaced the kitchen faucet without telling me, said the old one had been dripping. It hadn't been dripping, or if it had, it was my faucet to deal with. He started inviting his friends over on Friday nights, friends from work, people I had never met, who filled my living room and used my kitchen and stayed until past midnight. I went to bed early on those nights. I told myself I was just tired. I was 66 years old and I was retreating to my bedroom in my own home on Friday nights because a man I barely knew had decided the space was his. There was an afternoon in August, about 5 months in, when I overheard him on his phone in the backyard. He didn't know I was in the kitchen. He was talking to someone, a friend, I think, and I caught the end of a sentence. Just a matter of time before the whole thing is ours anyway, right? She's not going to live forever. I stood still at the sink. I ran the tap so he couldn't hear me not moving. My hands were cold under the hot water. I did not say anything. I know how that sounds. But you have to understand something that I think most people on the outside of a situation like this don't fully grasp. When it is your own child's partner, when your daughter is standing in your kitchen every morning drinking coffee and looking at you with familiar eyes, it is very difficult to say out loud, "I think this man has a plan." It sounds paranoid. It sounds like the kind of thing a grieving older woman imagines because she is lonely and afraid and hasn't adjusted to being alone. I had spent enough time in that house wondering which version of reality was true. My daughter's behavior was harder to read. She wasn't cruel. She never raised her voice at me. But she had started agreeing with him about things by reflex, the way people do when they've been with someone long enough that their own opinions have slowly taken the shape of that person's. When I said I was cold and wanted to turn up the heat, she said the house was fine, he ran warm. When I said I'd prefer to have dinner earlier, she said it didn't work with his schedule. When I mentioned a noise the furnace was making, she said her partner had looked at it and said it was normal. He was not a furnace technician. The line of credit was the moment everything changed for me. I found out about it by accident. I had an appointment with my financial advisor in the fall, a routine review of my retirement accounts. She mentioned almost in passing that there was an open home equity line of credit against my property, $80,000, accessed 4 months earlier. I asked her to say that again. She turned her screen to show me. I drove home in a kind of controlled numbness. I did not go inside immediately. I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes. I thought about what it meant to have $80,000 borrowed against the house I had owned outright for 11 years since Arthur and I paid off the mortgage. I thought about my signature, which was apparently on the application. I have a very distinctive signature. I have signed my name the same way since I was 22 years old. There is no version of events where I signed that form and forgot about it. When I went inside, my daughter was in the kitchen. Her partner was not home. I put my bag on the chair and I sat down across from her and I said, very calmly, that I needed to talk to her about the line of credit. Her face did something complicated. It lasted less than a second, but I have known that face since it was born, and what I saw in that second was not confusion, it was recognition. She said they had only meant to borrow it temporarily. She said they'd had some unexpected expenses. She said the interest rate was low and they were already paying it down. She said they had planned to tell me. She said her partner had handled all the paperwork and she had thought it was above board. I asked her why my signature was on documents I hadn't signed. She said she didn't know. She said I should ask him. He came home that evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table. My daughter was somewhere in the back of the house, very quiet. I told him what I knew. I told him clearly, without tears, without raising my voice, because I am 67 years old and I have had 31 years of practice managing difficult conversations in a room where the power belongs to the person who stays calm. He denied it at first, then he shifted to explaining it. Then he shifted to telling me that improvements to the house had increased its value and I ought to be grateful. He used the word grateful, the way people use it when they mean, stop asking questions you have the right to ask. Then he said that eventually the house would be my daughter's anyway, so it was practically the same as if the money had been borrowed by a future owner. That was when I understood there would be no reasoning with him. That was when I stopped trying. I said I would need them to vacate the property. He laughed. He actually laughed. He said I had no idea how tenancy law worked in Ontario. He said they had established residency. He said I would have to go through the landlord and tenant board to remove them, and that process took months, sometimes longer. He said by the time it was over, we'd have worked something out. He said it like he was doing me a favor. My daughter came into the kitchen then. She stood beside him, not beside me, beside him. I looked at her for a long moment. She looked at the floor. I went to my room. I closed the door. I did not cry, which surprised me. I think I had already started moving into a different mode, something quieter and more purposeful than grief. I thought of Arthur, the way I always do when I need to know what to do. Arthur had a saying he picked up from an older electrician he'd apprenticed under: "Don't fight the wire, find the circuit." He meant that brute force wastes energy. Find the source, work from there. I called a lawyer the next morning while they were still asleep. A woman named Patricia Chen, a family and property law specialist in Hamilton with an office on King Street West. I had been given her name by a colleague years ago for an entirely different reason, and the business card had lived in my desk drawer ever since. I don't believe in coincidences. Arthur always said I was the least superstitious person he'd ever met, but I do believe that information arrives before we know we need it. I met with Patricia that afternoon. I brought everything I had: the original deed in my name, the CMHC records from the original purchase, 30 years of property tax statements, the financial advisor's documentation of the line of credit, my bank records showing I had not received a cent of that $80,000, and a photograph of my distinctive signature beside the one on the LOC application, which was close, but not quite right, if you knew what you were looking at. Patricia knew what she was looking at. She was methodical and quiet while I spoke. She asked clarifying questions. She did not react dramatically to anything, which I appreciated. When I finished, she said I had 3 things working in my favor. The property was in my name alone with no joint tenancy. The signature discrepancy was documentable. And because no formal tenancy agreement had ever been established, the occupancy situation was more complex than he had implied, but not impossible to address with the right approach. She also said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that people who manipulate older homeowners often rely on the homeowner's reluctance to make the situation public. They count on the shame of it, the shame of admitting your own family has done this. She said, the moment you stop protecting them from consequences, the leverage reverses completely. She filed an emergency application with the Superior Court of Justice based on the fraudulent line of credit and the evidence of financial elder abuse. She also contacted Hamilton Police Financial Crimes Unit. She said the eviction proceeding and the fraud investigation could run simultaneously, that the courts moved faster when there was documented criminal activity involved. She asked me if I was prepared for what came next, for what it would mean for my relationship with my daughter. I told her yes. I think I had been preparing for it since I sat in my car in the driveway. I went back home. I said nothing. I moved carefully through those days like a woman walking on a surface she doesn't fully trust. I copied every document I could access. I removed my original deed from the filing cabinet in the basement and replaced it with a copy. I gathered my medications, my mother's brooch, Arthur's watch, and my teaching pension statements, and I put them in a bag I kept under my bed. I told no one what I had done. 3 days after my meeting with Patricia, I was sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, drinking my coffee, when my son-in-law walked in and told me they had decided to have the main bathroom renovated. He said he'd already gotten quotes. He said it would improve the property value. He said I should thank him for thinking ahead. He slid a piece of paper across the table, an estimate, $22,000. I looked at the estimate. I looked at him. I said I would not be authorizing any renovation. His face shifted. He said it wasn't really up to me at this point, was it, given that they were the ones actually maintaining the property. I said I owned the property. He said ownership was a complicated word. Then he stood up very close to where I was sitting, which I understand now was meant to be physically intimidating, and he said it was time for me to start thinking about what kind of arrangement made sense for everyone going forward, because things were going to change whether I wanted them to or not. My daughter walked in during that. She heard the last part. She did not say anything to him. She looked at me with something I couldn't fully identify. Regret, maybe, or a kind of exhaustion. She poured herself coffee and left the room. He took a step back. Then he told me I should start thinking about smaller accommodations, that a woman my age, alone, didn't need this much space, that it would be kinder, actually, to downsize, to find something easier to manage, a condo maybe, and let people who were building a life have the family home. He said all of this reasonably, almost gently, the way a person speaks when they have rehearsed it and are pleased with how it sounds. I said, "You need to leave my house." He said, "Try and make us." Then he put his hand on my shoulder. Not violently exactly, but with a firmness that was meant to communicate something, and he moved me, physically moved me, half a step to the side, the way you move an object that's in the way. It was not a push exactly, but it was a removal. I felt it in my whole body, not just the shoulder. I picked up my coat. I picked up the bag from under the bed, which took 30 seconds because I had been ready. I walked down the hallway. He was on his phone already, his back to me, talking to someone. I heard, "She's gone. Finally, tell everyone to come over. We're celebrating tonight." I opened the front door. I walked out. I stood on the front step in the cold October air, and I breathed. The silver maple Arthur planted was dropping its last leaves. I watched 2 of them fall. Then I called Patricia. She had been waiting for this call. She said, "Good. The application is ready. I've already been in contact with the court. We can move by this afternoon." She asked if I had a safe place to go. I said yes. My friend and neighbor Dorothy lived 4 houses down. I had already spoken to her 3 days earlier, after my first meeting with Patricia. Dorothy is 71, a retired nurse, one of those people who understands what it means when a friend shows up at the door with a bag and a very specific kind of calm. She made me tea. She didn't fuss. She sat across from me in her kitchen and asked what she could do. I told her about the lawyer, the plan, the timing. She said she'd drive me wherever I needed to go. She said her ex-husband had once told her she was too stubborn for her own good, and she'd like to think that trait was transferable. The fraud application had already produced results. The bank had flagged the line of credit for investigation based on Patricia's letter and the signature analysis she had commissioned from a forensic document examiner. Ontario's land registry had been notified of the potential fraudulent transaction. A detective from the Financial Crimes Unit had called Patricia that morning to schedule a meeting. The court granted an emergency occupancy order at 3:15 that afternoon. Given the documented fraud, the physical intimidation, and the fact that no formal lease existed, the judge agreed that the standard landlord and tenant board process did not apply and that my safety and ownership rights required immediate remedy. 2 officers from Hamilton Police would meet us at the house at 5 o'clock. Dorothy and I sat in her car outside my house at 10 minutes to 5. There were cars parked all the way down the crescent. Music was playing. Through the front window, I could see figures moving around, silhouettes against the light. They'd put something up along the back fence. Streamers, maybe, or lights. A celebration. In my house. 3 hours after he had moved me out of my own kitchen like furniture. Patricia arrived first. Then the 2 officers. One was a woman about 40, steady and professional. The other was younger, Quiet. They reviewed the court order. They asked me to confirm the property was mine and that the occupants had no legal authorization to remain. I confirmed it. My voice was level. I was surprised by how level it was. We walked up the front path. The music was loud enough that no one inside noticed us until the officer knocked. 3 solid knocks. The music didn't stop. She knocked again, louder. Hamilton Police. Please open the door. The music stopped. The door opened. He was standing there with a bottle of beer and a look on his face that went from annoyed to blank to something I can only describe as realizing, all in about 2 seconds. He saw the officers. He saw Patricia. He saw me behind them on my own front step. He said, "What is this?" The officer said, "Sir, we have a court order requiring you to vacate this property. The property belongs to Margaret and she has not authorized your continued occupancy. I need you to step back and allow us to enter." He said, "This is our home. We live here. You can't just—" Patricia stepped forward and handed him the paperwork. "The Superior Court of Justice disagrees. You have 30 minutes to collect essential personal items under supervision. Anything left behind can be retrieved at a later date by appointment." My daughter appeared behind him. She was wearing a sweater I'd given her 2 Christmases ago, soft blue, cashmere. She looked at me, and her face did something it hadn't done in a very long time. It cracked open, not in anger, in something that looked a great deal like shame. The guests filtered out in the next 10 minutes. They came through the front door in pairs and small groups, confused, holding wine glasses and paper plates. A few of them looked at me as they passed. One woman, older, maybe a friend of his from work, stopped and said she was sorry, she hadn't known. I nodded. I believed her. He argued for a while. He talked about tenant rights, about the Residential Tenancies Act, about how this wasn't legal, how Patricia didn't know what she was doing, how he was going to sue the city. Patricia let him talk. She had heard it before. She said if he'd like to contest the court order, he was welcome to do so through proper channels, but that this evening he was required to vacate and his cooperation would be noted. My daughter didn't argue. She went to the bedroom and packed a bag. She carried it out past me in the hallway without making eye contact. When she reached the door, she stopped. She turned around. She said, "I'm sorry, Mum." Her voice was very small. It was the voice she'd had at 9 years old when she broke something she shouldn't have been touching. I said, "I know." She nodded. She walked out. He left last. He walked past me without speaking. On the front step, he turned around and looked at me with an expression I want to remember accurately because I think it matters to be precise about these things. It was not rage. It was not contempt. It was something more like surprise, genuine surprise, as if he had genuinely not believed this moment was possible. As if he had looked at a 67-year-old retired schoolteacher and calculated, very carefully, that she would never actually do this. That she was too afraid, too attached, too in need of not being alone. He had miscalculated. He got in his car. They drove away. The taillights turned the corner and disappeared. I stood on my front step in the October dark. The silver maples stood in the backyard, mostly bare now. There were streamers along the back fence, orange and gold. There were plastic cups and bottles on the patio furniture. There were crumbs on my kitchen counter and someone else's dishes in my sink. It looked like the aftermath of a party that had ended badly for the people who threw it. Dorothy hugged me before she left. She squeezed both my hands. She said, "Arthur would have loved every minute of this." I laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere you forgot existed. She was absolutely right. Arthur would have stood on that step with his arms folded and a look of enormous satisfaction and told me I had handled it better than he could have. I changed the locks that same evening. Dorothy had thought to bring a locksmith, a friend of her son's, who arrived at 6:30 with a kit and did every exterior door in 45 minutes. He charged me $180 and would not let me tip him. He said anyone who went through what I'd gone through deserved a discount. I thanked him and meant it. Then I cleaned. It took until 11 o'clock. I removed the party debris from the backyard. I washed every surface in the kitchen. I took down whatever they had hung on the walls. I found things of mine they had moved to the basement. A lamp. Arthur and I had brought back from a trip to Cape Breton, a set of books from my classroom that I had kept when I retired. a framed photo of my mother that had always stood on the sideboard. I brought them all back upstairs. I put them where they belonged. I went to the master bedroom and I changed the bedding with sheets that smelled like the lavender sachets I keep in the linen closet. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. On the nightstand, Arthur's watch, which I had carried in my bag for 3 days and now put back where it lived. I said hello to him the way I always do, in my head, in the private language of a 41-year marriage. Then I lay down, in my bed, in my house, and I slept. The investigation took 4 months. The forensic document examiner confirmed that the signatures on the line of credit application were forged. The bank conducted its own review and determined that the $80,000 had been withdrawn in 3 installments and used primarily for payments on debt my son-in-law had accumulated from a period before he met my daughter. He had been managing financial problems for years that neither my daughter nor I had known about. The police laid charges under Section 380 of the Criminal Code. Fraud over $5,000. My daughter was not charged. She had not known the details, the investigators concluded, though she had known enough to stand beside him and say nothing when I found out. That knowledge, and her choice about what to do with it, is something she and I have had to address separately, over time, in a harder and slower way than a court proceeding. The funds were partially recovered through asset seizure during the criminal process. My lawyer filed a civil claim for the remainder. The line of credit was closed, and the fraudulent application removed from my file. The bank, to their credit, did not hold me responsible for any portion of the debt. I called a contractor in the spring. I had the things in the house fixed that should have been fixed years ago. A bathroom that had been gathering moisture, a section of the back fence that had softened, the furnace, which had in fact been making a noise worth addressing. I paid for it with money I had earned and saved over 31 years of teaching other people's children how to read and think and find themselves inside a story. Dorothy and I went to Prince Edward Island in August. We drove because we both like driving and because it takes you through New Brunswick, which is beautiful in a way that reminds you that this country is enormous and mostly made of things that have nothing to do with whatever trouble you're carrying. We stayed in a small inn outside Charlottetown for 5 days. We ate lobster. We walked along the red cliffs in the evenings. We talked about Arthur and about Dorothy's late mother and about what it means to get to this age and still be standing. On the last evening, we sat on the small deck of the inn and watched the sun go down over the water. Dorothy said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" She said, "That man's face when he opened the door." I started laughing and couldn't stop for a full minute. My daughter and I are in contact. It is careful and slow, and nowhere near what it was, but it is something, and I have chosen not to let go of it entirely because she is still my daughter, and because I watched her face when she said she was sorry in my hallway, and I believe she meant it. She is in therapy. She has moved into an apartment of her own, a 1-bedroom in Stony Creek, not far from where we used to live when she was small. She has a job she likes. She seems lighter than she was. She has not asked me about the house. She knows better. She knows that the house is mine, that it has always been mine, that her father and I built it the way we built everything in our lives, carefully, together, with ordinary money and extraordinary patience. And she knows that I will decide what happens to it, if and when I decide, and that no one will make that choice for me. He was convicted in March. I did not attend the sentencing. I didn't need to. I had already had my day in the thing I needed most. That was October, the night the music stopped and the door opened, and a 67-year-old retired English teacher walked back into her own home. The silver maple leafed out again this spring. It does every spring. It does what it has always done. There are people who will listen to this story and ask why I didn't act sooner, why I let months go by, why I didn't call the police the moment I found out about the line of credit. I understand why they ask. I might have asked the same thing before. But I want to say something to anyone who is in the early part of a situation like this, anyone who is watching small things shift and telling themselves they're imagining it. The fear of being wrong about your own family is enormous. The fear of blowing up something you love and being the one everyone blames is real. It takes time to understand that the thing you're trying to protect has already been broken by the other person, long before you decided to stop pretending it hadn't. I am not a victim. I was briefly in a situation where someone treated me like one. There is a difference. I am 67 years old. I live in my own house, on a quiet crescent in Hamilton, with a silver maple in the backyard and a locksmith's card in the kitchen drawer, just in case. I have a friend 4 houses down who shows up with tea and doesn't fuss. I have a pension. I have 31 years of students who learned things in my classroom they are still carrying. I have Arthur's watch on the nightstand. I have everything I need. If you stayed with me until the end of this story, leave a 1 in the comments. If it meant something to you, you can like the video. There are more stories on this channel from people who've been through things that nearly broke them and decided not to let them. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves.